Manage the manageable. Manage the manageable. Last week, we introduced this as a seventh precept that I proposed as being vital or indispensable, if you will, to our realizing to the fullest extent the present rest that God has promised His people. The present rest. Please recall that this corresponds to the third major consideration in a larger series that has had us examining God's promised rests. And those rests, as we have come to see, pertain to the past, to the future, a prospective rest, and also to the present. I want to direct your attention to the outline or to the handout that I gave you because it does contain an outline of the entire series, and I hope that will satisfy you by way of review because I really want to jump into new material, and really that is going to be our continuing a discussion of this current indispensable precept that again promotes this present rest that has been offered, even promised by God. A rest, a present rest, that is clearly perceived in Jesus' invitation that we read of in Matthew chapter 11, beginning in verse 28. Again, listen, come unto me, Jesus invites, all ye that labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn of me, for I am meek and lowly in heart. Notice, you shall find rest for your souls, for my yoke is easy and my burden is light. And so that is the promised rest that God has for us right now, a spiritual rest. And again, on the outline there, if you'll look under major point 3, that's what we're talking about, this present rest, a spiritual rest from the guilt and the condemnation and the enslavement of sin. I will take a moment to make a footnote here. It was pointed out to me last week that I can't spell, and that was no revelation to me. But anyways, if you look there on major point 3, the word indispensable is misspelled. That shouldn't be I-B-L-E, that should be A-B-L-E. And I don't know how many of you looked on the board over the past 3.5 months, and maybe you recognized it, but it was way off up here. I had I-P-L-E. So thanks to Harold, I don't have to embarrass myself anymore. That's corrected on the board. It's still wrong on your outline. So please, if you will, take a pen and correct that, but that's my bad. Thank you, Harold. I appreciate it. But again, this seventh one corresponds to letter G under major point 3. So especially for the alley goods, we're on the second page, almost to the end, but we're looking at letter G. Notice again that precept, manage the manageable. And as we advanced last week, this particular precept, I believe, is essential. It is indispensable to our enjoying God's promised present rest fully, because let's face it, there are always going to be some matters that will inevitably introduce troubling unrest into our hearts. There will always be some matters that will inevitably introduce frustrating disquiet into our lives. And those matters, many of them, are things over which we have no control. Now, last week, we offered at least a few examples of what some of those matters might be. Other people, friends. What people think, what people say, what people do, we have no control over. Or what about external incidents like natural disasters or weather in general? What about traffic? What about politics? And then what about changing circumstances was the third of those examples. Changing circumstances, changes in our health, changes in our job. What about death of a loved one? What about life-changing accidents that can occur? What about some serious financial setback that might dramatically impact me and my family? Friends, I think all of us would acknowledge that these things, they have the potential of disrupting our inward rest. I would submit that they even can rob us of that spiritual peace that God desires for us. He intends for us to have, and He has promised us that we can have it. But these things can take that from us. And surely we would all agree that these things, other people, external incidents, changing circumstances, friends, we would all agree, most of those are not things that we can manage. They are out of our control. And so, last week we posed the question, how are we going to safeguard our souls from surrendering our spiritual rest, this peace that God wants us to have, all the while facing these matters over which we have no control? You know what the answer is? It's our precept. It's our letter G. We've got to learn to manage the manageable. Now, in analyzing that precept of managing the manageable, obviously, the first thing we need to recognize is what is manageable and what is not manageable. Now, some of those are easy to distinguish. Sometimes, Ricky, that can be a bit challenging. And I think more often than not, the reason it's challenging is because we would like to be able to manage more than what we actually can. And so the first thing we have to do, we have to accept some things are just not in our control. Some things that negatively impact us, some things that potentially can rob us of this rest, this spiritual peace, are things over which we cannot manage. I'll have more to say about this, Lord willing, a little later on, but I certainly want to encourage us, and I begin with myself. We need to be praying for God's wisdom to discern the difference between what we can manage and what we cannot. But then we began examining some examples that might help us illustrate this precept of managing the manageable. And we started by looking at some examples that particularly pertain to managing the manageable as it relates to other people. I submitted that Romans 12:18, I think, is a good place to begin. Let me invite your attention quickly back there just to revisit that. In Romans chapter 12 and verse 18, we have some inspired counsel that is given to us as Christians that I believe even in the wording, Chris, even in the wording of the passage, it seems to attest to this distinction that exists between what we can manage and what we cannot. And so, if you're there, Romans 12, verse 18, notice it says, "If it be possible, as much as lieth in you, live peaceably with all men." Now, the imperative, what we are called upon to do is live peaceably with all men. But then you have those two qualifying phrases. And I think in those two qualifying phrases, we see what is manageable and what sometimes is not. Notice the middle one, as much as lieth in you. Friends, that's always manageable. As far as it depends on me, friends, that's my responsibility. I can control that. Even that very phrase speaks to that, as much as it is in you to do this. And it is. Whatever is in me, whatever I'm capable of doing, that's what I should do to try to promote peace, to live peaceably with all men. That part is the manageable part. But look at the other qualifying phrase, if it be possible. Now, friends, that part might fall outside of what I can manage. It may not be possible. But as much as is possible, and it's up to me, I need to be living peaceably with all men. And then especially for the alley goods, I shared with the class or with the congregation here, I shared with you how that I think it's interesting right there in that context. He talks about promoting things that I can do to live peaceably with my enemies, for instance. And that's certainly part of living peaceably with all men. And many times those with whom I am not at peace is because they're my enemies. They have made themselves my enemies. So what is within my power? What is my responsibility? What can I do to live peaceably even with my enemies? Well, look at it. For instance, look at verse 14. Bless them that persecute you, bless and curse not. See, I can do that. That's in my power to determine how I'm going to speak to my enemy. Will I bless them? I can. That will promote peace, possibly. But I should never curse. Or what about verse 17? Don't recompense evil for evil. See, that's in my power. When my enemy does me evil, I don't have to return evil for evil. In fact, as a Christian, I shouldn't. Here's what I ought to do. I ought to recompense no man evil for evil. I ought to be doing good, things that are honorable. Look at verse 19. Don't avenge yourself. Don't try to get back. That's in my power to do. Here's what I ought to do. I ought to yield to God's wrath because He said, vengeance is mine. I'll repay. See, these are things that I can do. And then look at verses 20 and 21. Therefore, if your enemy hunger, feed him. If he's thirsty, give him drink. In so doing, you're going to heap coals of fire on its head. Don't be overcome of evil, but overcome evil with good. You see, friends, all of those things are in my power. That's part of if it lies in you. And all of this is what I can choose to do. All right, here's what is not manageable. How my enemy responds to that. See, that I have no control over. I can do what God tells me to do to live peaceably, even with my enemies. What I can control is how they're going to respond to it. And we looked at two great examples of that from the Bible. Number one, King David. David, he had an enemy. You know who his enemy was? The previous king, King Saul. And you know what David did? David did all that was in his power. All that was in his power. All that he could manage to live peaceably with King Saul. And so when he had opportunities to take his life, he never did. He never did. In fact, he would come out and he would say, King Saul, I could have killed you today, but I'm never going to kill you. That's God's place. That's not mine. He would bow down. He would bless the king. He's doing all that Romans 12 encourage us to do as Christians. And you know what? King Saul would say, I'm sorry, David. And then right afterwards, start chasing him again, trying to kill David again. See, David didn't have control over how King Saul would respond to how he treated him. He treated him the way he should have. He treated him trying to promote peace because that's what David could control. But what he couldn't control was how King Saul was going to respond. And many times, it wasn't the right way. That's why the peace didn't exist. It wasn't because of David. It was because of King Saul. Because that was the part that was out of his control. But then the greatest example, and one that should have really the most import to us, and that's Jesus himself. Friends, think about it. Jesus left heaven to come to earth. You know why? Because he was trying to make peace with his enemies. You know who his enemies were? Us. Romans 5, verse 10, for if when we were his enemies, we were reconciled to God by the death of his Son, Jesus came to earth. He did good. Even though we returned evil, he did good. Eternal good. To make peace possible for us. And you know how many of his enemies responded? Some of them put him on the cross. He came to do good to those people, and in return, they crucified him. Many other people dismiss him. Many other people are irreverent to Jesus. See, he doesn't have any control over how his enemy would respond, but he did all that was in his power to promote peace, to live peaceably. So much so that when he's on the cross, dying for his enemy, after his enemies put him there, you remember what he's doing? He's praying, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. See, that's the counsel of Romans chapter 12, verse 14. He blessed rather than cursed. They're cursing him, he's praying for them. So, I just want us to see, friends, the Bible helps us understand this precept. Manage the manageable. Do what you can, and as much as you can. In fact, Brother Lipscomb said this with regards to what we should be doing to live peaceably with all men. He said, quote, use all means in your power to live peaceably with all men. For the sake of peace, sacrifice everything except truth and right. Everything else, we ought to be willing to give up if we can live peaceably. That part depends on me. How they respond, I have no control over that. I have no control. But I got to do my part. My part. Let's look at another one quickly. This also has to do with people. And maybe you'll appreciate this one. Look at Proverbs chapter 15, verse 1. Many of you might even know that. Once you read it, you'll recognize it. Proverbs chapter 15 and verse 1. A soft answer, remember it? Turns away wrath. But grievous words stir up anger. Now, would you agree with me? That's a wise maxim. Here, it's provided us by the inspired penman Solomon. And again, it's a wise proverb. But a maxim, please remember, is a general truth. You know what that means? It often proves to be true. But it's not absolute. It's not always. Because, friends, a soft answer is not going to always result in turning away another's anger. Again, what about Jesus? Jesus had a soft answer on the cross. Did that turn away their anger? Not at all. Not at all. In fact, I think it's interesting in Paul's describing those who did not like to retain God in their knowledge in Romans chapter 1. Particularly in verse 8, he goes on to explain that they are going to be filled with all unrighteousness. And then he's going to elaborate on what some of those unrighteous attitudes and behaviors look like. And I know not all translations have this, but the King James Version uses the word in verse 31, implacable. Now, Tracy, I don't use that word very often. So I looked it up. Implacable. You know what one English definition is for that word? Not capable of being appeased. You see, some people who do not know God, it doesn't matter what you do. It doesn't matter how you answer them. They are implacable. They cannot be appeased. In other words, their anger is going to continue. So here you are, you're trying to promote peace. You're trying to promote peace with somebody who is angry at you, and you do all that is in your power to do. You do what the Bible counsels you. You provide them a soft answer, and yet they remain angry. And they do not accept your invitation for peace, the prospect of peace. You know why? Because I have no control over that. You see, that's the first part of Romans chapter 12, 18. If it be possible, some people, it's not possible. Some people are implacable. Some people, it doesn't matter how you answer them, when they're angry at you, you're not going to appease them. You're not going to promote peace for them. Because, friends, sometimes it's not possible. It's not possible. But please hear me. please hear me as we leave this section. Please hear me. If we cannot be at peace with somebody else, that should never be because of me. See, that's my responsibility. I need to be living peaceably with all men as much as is possible with me, but for some people that's not going to be possible. And I cannot permit, see, this comes into a play with our present rest. I cannot permit, friends, these matters that are not manageable, that are out of my control, how other people who are angry with me respond when I try to give them a soft answer, or how my enemy treats me even though I'm trying to treat them with good. I can't control that. And friends, I cannot allow that to rob me of my rest. I've done everything that God has called upon me to do. But it just wasn't possible. But not because of me, because of somebody else. All right, very quickly, let's move on now to another area. We talked about managing the manageable as it relates to other people. But what about these externals? What about these external incidents? What about these changing circumstances? How do we deal with those? Because again, many of those are out of our control. And yet they have the capability, they have the potential of robbing me of this peace that God wants me to have, this present rest that Jesus invites us to have. So how do I deal with that? Well, quickly, turn to the book of Ecclesiastes, please. Ecclesiastes chapter 8. I don't know how many of those present here, not the alley goods, but those who are part of the congregation. A number of years back, we did a series from the book of Ecclesiastes, particularly Ecclesiastes chapter 8. And at that time, maybe you will recall that we actually referenced this verse. But look at Ecclesiastes chapter 8 and verse 6, please. Ecclesiastes chapter 8 and verse 6. It reads, "Because to every purpose there is time and judgment, therefore the misery of man is great upon him." That word misery, maybe we should think of a state of emotional distress. You know, if you're miserable, you're not at rest. You're not at peace. All right, but here's what one writer submitted. Quote, "Man's misery," again, emotional distress, "man's misery begins when he cannot accept what life offers as he lives on God's time." End of quote. Listen to that again. Man's misery begins when he cannot accept what life offers as he lives on God's time. End of quote. Because a lot of those things that happen to us on God's time aren't favorable. They are some of those external incidents like natural disasters, right, Tracy? You lost a home to a tornado, all right? Or a life-changing incident or accident, or loss of health, or financial reverse. You see, if we can't accept those things, they're going to produce emotional distress. They're going to give us misery. They're going to steal that present rest that God desires for us to have, that Jesus invites us to have. Friends, is it not the case that we often forfeit our spiritual rest because we are troubled, we are perplexed by things that happen in this life that we don't have an answer for? They puzzle us, they baffle us, whether we experience them or we just witness them. It may fall in the category of social injustices or moral dilemmas or emotional quandaries. Maybe it might even have to do with God's providence and how He deals with various people and ourselves. And if we can't answer it, if we don't understand why, sometimes that can disturb that peace, that rest that God would have us to possess. For Solomon, the writer of Ecclesiastes, look at one of the things that he found troubling. Look at verse 14 of that chapter. He says, there is a vanity which is done upon the earth, that there be just men unto whom it happened according to the work of the wicked. And again, there be wicked men to whom it happens according to the work of the righteous. I said that this also is vanity. You see his quandary? He says, here's a good man, and what's happening to him in life seems to be what should be happening to the wicked. Oh, here's a wicked man, and everyone knows it, but he prospers. He's living a long life. He's got a lot of children. He's got all this wealth, all this power. And there seems to be this inability to harmonize that. Isn't that what was going on with Job, Harold? Job is a righteous man, and what he is experiencing seems to be those things that his friends said should be happening to the wicked. And that's why they said, you must be wicked, Job. And Job said, no, I'm not wicked. I don't know why it's going on. I'm as perplexed as you are. I don't understand it, but it's not that reason. And Solomon says, that troubles a lot of people. So what do you do with it? Well, drop down to look at verse 16. So when I applied mine heart to know wisdom and to see the business that is done upon the earth, listen to this. For also there is that neither day nor night sees sleep with his eyes. That is a great insertion there. When you're not at rest, what happens? Internally, you can't sleep at night, right? And that's exactly what Solomon is saying. These things sometimes cause you that you can't sleep. Because here you are, you're trying to figure this out. You're trying to answer these questions. You're trying to understand. You're applying your heart to wisdom, and you're applying it without getting any satisfactory answers. And guess what? You can't even sleep at night. So what does he say? Verse 17. Then I beheld all the work of God, that a man cannot find out the work that is done under the sun. Because though a man labor to seek it out, he shall not find it. Yea, further, even though a wise man thinks to know it, he shall not be able to find it out. You know what Solomon is acknowledging? It doesn't matter how wise you are. And remember, Solomon was the wisest man on earth until Jesus came. And he said, it just doesn't matter. There are some things you're not going to understand. The works of God, you're not going to understand them. Look over in chapter 11. Look at verse 5. Ladies, and just all of us, we can appreciate this, right? As you do not know what is the way of the Spirit, nor how the bones grow in the womb of her that is with child. Does that baffle any of you? I've got a daughter who's pregnant, and you know what? She's getting larger and larger and larger. You know what? I don't understand that. I don't understand how God put all that together. And then how did he put the child's spirit in that womb, in that baby that's growing? Do we understand that? It's still a mystery. Many people call it a miracle. Well, it's not a miracle, it's natural, but it's mysterious, is it not? And Solomon is acknowledging, just like that, like a mystery like that. Look at what he says. Even so, in the same way, you do not know the works of God who makes all. There are things that God is responsible for in governing this world, and you'll never understand them. You'll never understand them. So throughout the book of Ecclesiastes, Solomon is urging man, enjoy the goodness that bountifully issues from God in this life, and do not allow your spirit to be at unrest. Don't be disquieted. Don't forfeit that peace of spirit because of things that are too high and too deep for you. Those are under God's control, and we don't have to know them. You just manage the manageable. The others, that's under God's control. That's not up to us. Can you see how accepting that would allow us to have peace even in the midst of troubling circumstances in our life? But we have to be willing to accept this precept. I can only manage the manageable. There are some things that are always going to be outside my control. So, question, what do I do with the parts that aren't manageable? All right? You see, I can't control what goes on outside of me, but you know what I can always control? What goes on inside me. And that's my responsibility. In fact, that's what we're talking about here, isn't it? We're talking about inner peace. We're talking about a spiritual rest that happens inside. I always can control that. I can't control what's going on outside, but I can always control what's going on inside. And that, friends, that is going to determine whether this rest is realized by me or it is relinquished by me. And I allow the things outside of me to rob me of it. How I respond to other people, how I respond to external incidents, how I respond to changing circumstances, that's manageable. That's for me to choose how I'm going to do that. You know what else is manageable for me? What I think about those things. You see, what I think on while these possibly disturbing and troubling things enter into my life is inevitably going to impact whether I enjoy the spiritual rest that Jesus offers me or not. And we'll conclude with this. I had more to say, but we need to bring this to a conclusion. But look over at Philippians chapter 4. You remember I said Philippians chapter 4 through about verse 9? That this is kind of like a roadmap. It's a recipe. It's a blueprint for having the peace of God. In fact, it's in those verses that we find that phrase, verse 7, and the peace of God, which passeth all understanding. That's this spiritual rest. That's this present rest that Jesus wants us to have. Here it's called the peace of God. So, immediately after talking about the peace of God, look at what he says, verse 8. You know what you're responsible for? How you think. And you know what? Chris, I'm always responsible for what I think. In fact, 2 Corinthians chapter 10 and verse 5 says, we are to bring every thought into captivity unto the obedience of Christ. You know what? I am responsible for every thought that I ever entertain, because that's me. That's me. And so when things are going on outside of me that I have no control over, what am I thinking? How am I thinking when those things are going on? So that it doesn't disturb my rest. Well, let's read it. Verse 8. Finally, brethren, whatever things are true, whatever things are honest, whatever things are just, whatever things are pure, whatever things are lovely, whatever things are of good report, if there's any virtue, if there's any praise, think on these things, listen to it. Those things which you have both learned and received and heard and seen in me, you do those, and the God of peace. What? The God of peace shall be with you. Angie, it's almost like they're bookends. The peace of God, verse 7. The God of peace, verse 9. And you know what's in the middle? What you think. What do you think? Because that part is always manageable. So if I think about the right thing, I can have the peace of God that passes all understanding. I can have the God of peace with me. I can have that present rest. Now, what do you do about the things that aren't manageable? Well, we won't have time to investigate it, but look back at verse 6. Don't worry about it, first of all. Worrying about it is not going to change it. That's just futile. And not only does worry not change anything, but it also causes you unrest. Worry, anxiety, that's what promotes spiritual disquietness in our hearts. So don't do that. What should you do? Pray. Pray to God. See, worrying, I can't do anything. Praying, the Bible says it's effectual. It'll accomplish a lot. In fact, Ephesians 3 verse 20 says, prayer, it can do more than you ever thought or ask of God to do. So that's how we respond. That's what we do with the things that aren't manageable. We pray to God about those because He's in control. He's in control. The part that's in my control is how I think about those things. So I hope this one was helpful. I know it is for me because I got to tell you, sometimes I just don't like to accept the fact that some things aren't out of my control. And that bothers me. It causes me to worry. It gives me anxiety because I want it to be in my control and it's not. And sometimes it does disturb that present rest that Jesus invites us to have and wants us to have. So we have one more, Lord willing, and that's the hope of heaven. And that's a powerful one. That's a precept that will certainly help us to have this present rest in its fullest measure. If you're here this morning, you never answered Jesus' invitation for rest. Your soul can be at rest. He invites everyone. Come unto me, all ye that labor and are heavy laden. It's our responsibility to come. We have to do it on His terms. Come to me, take my yoke upon you, learn of me. We got to do it that way. But if we do it that way, which is responding to the gospel in faith, if we do it that way, believing Him to be the Son of God, repenting of our sins, confessing His name before others, and being immersed in water for the forgiveness of those sins, if we do it, we can have rest. Freedom from the guilt, the condemnation, and even the bondage of sin. And then as Christians, I don't know about you, I'd like it to the fullest extent. So I got to take on these precepts. I got to embrace those and implement those in my life. But I believe if we do so, they will give us that rest that Jesus invites us and promises that we can have.